The chopper concept is like anything else, it's sort of a lifelong deal. When I was young, you learned to shoot first with single action 22 pistols or rifles. And then eventually you went up to like, double action revolvers, semi-auto rifle. So I grew up shooting revolvers. They were like my first love for sure. Revolvers were the first pistols that I ever carried for defensive work. And then I kind of got on the Jeff Cooper bandwagon, trained with him, several times. And so I went with the 1911. I carried the 1911 for years. But every time I would talk to the older guys, it was kind of interesting. Like guys that knew much more about this stuff than I probably ever will. They were all like the best handgun for personal defense, fighting, that kind of stuff is a revolver. And they would give me reasons, but sometimes when you're young, you think you know more or you know better than the older people that have done much more than you do. So it took me a few years to figure out why the revolver was such a great pistol for self-defense. And so then I got back into it, worked with it for, a long time. And one of my favorite revolvers was what they called the old FBI gun. It would be like a Model 13 Smith & Wesson K-frame with a round butt and a 3-inch barrel. Perfect defensive gun. Easy to carry, not that heavy, really great to shoot and all that. The problem is that there's not a whole lot of them around, and when you do find one of them, they're kind of expensive. So my solution to that was to find 4-inch barrel guns with square butts, which are pretty common, and then chop them down. So the name chopper comes from like the old original choppers motorcycles. I used to ride Harleys, customize them and that kind of thing. So the original choppers were not what they are like today, long raked out elaborate things. It was like you buy a motorcycle, then you strip everything off of it that's not absolutely necessary. The goal was to be lightweight, fast, and nimble for like city traffic. So that was kind of my inspiration. Hey, I'm taking something that's bigger and bulky, I'm chopping it down to what it needs to be. We're getting rid of anything that's not absolutely necessary, reducing size, weight, making it easy to carry, application is easier. And so that was my inspiration. That's where the name came up. And so I built a couple just to see if I could do it. Like technically, if you were going to take a 4-inch barrel and cut it down to 3, you would probably take the barrel off the frame and do all the fancy machine work and then put it back on. But especially when I was starting out, I didn't have a bunch of machinery. So I thought, hey, I can just like chop the barrel off, cut an inch off of it. But then that leaves like part of the factory lettering, so it says like Smith & Wesson on the side of the barrel. So I thought, well, I'm gonna reduce the weight by milling down the sides of the barrel. That also gets rid of that existing factory lettering, and it looks really cool. It's got a custom look to it, and it's easy for me to do in my shop with the tools that I have. So I built a couple of them, and people started seeing them, and it's like, man, I love this pistol. Can you do one for me? And so I did a couple for friends and stuff, and it kind of snowballed from there. It's been a whole lot bigger success than I originally anticipated. To the point now to where I can I'm wanting to back off some from the teaching, so I kind of teach in spring and fall now. That leaves me summer and winter to be in the shop to work on revolvers. So it worked out really good. It's one of those God things, right? He takes care of you, puts you where you need to be. So the revolver work has taken off a lot better. The concept is really, really good. People are digging it, and we're getting more work for it. So it's gonna be a big part of our business in the future, I think. The chopper involves like putting one together, making one, involves about like 4 steps and then about 100 sub steps in each one of those steps. So it's not just taking it and cutting parts off of it. Like for example, what we do, big thing is shorten the barrel down, cut the butt down to a round butt. Then we also will do stuff like narrowing the trigger guard, and so it makes it easier for the trigger finger to slide down to get on the trigger, but trigger's still protected like it needs to be. It's not just as simple as narrowing that trigger guard. Once you cut the width off of it, then you have to recontour the inside, you have to recontour the outside. Our goal with something like that is to get it looking like, hey, this came from the factory looking like this. So all your lines that you're working have to bleed in and match up with the factory lines. So there's nothing really simple about doing any of it. It's a very time-consuming process. So we're narrowing the trigger guards, we're bobbing the hammer because you don't want a hammer spur that can get caught up, and all your revolver work for defensive use is double action anyway. There's no single action work. We usually recontour the trigger because as you stroke the trigger on a revolver, your finger has to be moving, kind of sliding on that trigger. It's not going to be in the same place as you stroke that trigger. So you recontour the radius of the trigger to make it fit your finger, make it flow smoother. There's stuff like putting a slight radius on the front of the cylinder, which makes it a little bit easier to holster. We do a little melt job on the frame to clean those lines up, try to make it look better. Plus, if you're working with an older pistol that's maybe beat or scratched, nicked up, melting the frame usually takes all of those out, so it makes it look better, which is never a bad thing. We tune the internals for sure. Like your average, say, Smith & Wesson revolver, K-frame, that kind of thing off the shelf, you're going to have maybe a 12 to 13 pound trigger, which is sort of stiff. So what we want to do is smooth it out so it's a nice even stroke. There's no hitches or glitches. And we usually get them down to around 8 to 8.5 pounds. That's going to be a lot lighter, but it still guarantees you consistent ignition regardless of what ammo you're using. Like you can get one down to maybe 7.5 pound on the trigger, but then it's only going to work with like this specific ammunition. So what I want is one that's going to work with any ammunition that I feed it. So there's a lot of work. Pretty much every piece on the pistol is modified, smoothed out, polished, whatever you want to use, whatever term there. And then one of the big things with a defensive pistol is that you need sights that will work. So what we do is install the XS sight, the dot sight on there, which is really quick for close work, and that's where we know most of this stuff is going to take place. But it's also accurate enough that if you had to, as long as you practice, you can make like shots at 75 yards if it was necessary. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. And it's nothing that I came up with. You know, sometimes you think, wow, man, I just came up with a new way to cut this. And then you figure out, well, 80 years ago, these guys were doing the same thing that you're doing, you know. So it's just taking all the knowledge that's out there and trying to put it into one package. That again is great for defensive work. It's easy to carry, easy to apply. But it's all about making it fit the application. Smith & Wesson are great revolvers, but if you want one for hunting, you might be doing these kind of modifications. If you want one for carry, you might need to do these modifications. So it's like taking a really good car and then making it run and drive a whole lot better. The choppers are fighting pistols. I mean, I think they look cool, you know, but that's not the goal, is to make it, like our motto here is we don't do fancy. So what we're doing is, this is what you need for a defensive pistol. There's better looking pistols for sure. Like most of the finishes we do on the carbon steel guns, it's parkerized finish. We don't need a fancy finish. Parkerizings work great for military firearms. It works great for a defensive pistol. So it's just, again, the chopper thing is getting it down to the bare essentials that are gonna get the job done as efficiently as possible. If you're gonna get one to get put in a safe, I'd get like a much better looking one. You know what I'm saying? It would just be like, this is the gun that if my life depended on it, it's going to work for me every time. It might not be pretty, and like I tell people, it ain't got to be pretty, it just has to work. Revolvers are great for self-defense, and keep in mind, we're not talking about military, which is a different world. We're not talking about law enforcement, which is another different application. We're talking about, this is the pistol that I'm going to carry to defend myself, friends, family from whatever might happen. Revolvers are ideal for that. One thing, they come in great calibers. Like if you look at the numbers that appear most often as far as shots fired for self-defense situations, usually it's 3 or 4 shots fired. That's with like 380, 9mm, 40, 45. But when you start looking at like 357 Magnum, you're looking at about 1 to 2 shots fired. And yes, they make semi-autos in 357, but they're like really heavy, big and bulky, not something you can carry. So revolvers come in excellent rounds. Revolvers you can get in all kind of different sizes, so that's always good, because you could carry a full size one on your hip and maybe a smaller J-frame or something on the ankle. All the ammunition will mix, so that's really good. Commonality is good. We also know that a majority of these things are going to take place at extremely close quarters, like contact, kind of hands-on distance. If that happens with a semi-auto, if the slide gets pushed out of battery, it's not going to fire. With a revolver, I can jam it against somebody's ribs and still feed those rounds to them. And then if you look at like malfunctions, especially against self-defense situations, a revolver will have fewer malfunctions in a fight when conditions are far less than perfect. A revolver will have fewer malfunctions than a semi-auto. Semi-autos, the vast majority are recoil operated, so they have to have resistance in order for that system to function. A revolver, I can be like limp wristing it and it's still gonna bang and function as I stroke that trigger. So they're a lot more reliable for self-defense. They come in great calibers. You can carry 2 or 3 of them and all your ammunition is common. The big misconception though is that revolvers are great for beginners. The worst thing you can do is hand a beginner a revolver, especially a lightweight revolver in a heavy caliber. It's probably going to ruin them for life. Revolvers are more for like experts. They are not pistols for beginners. And the big saying is, you know, revolvers are the easiest pistols to shoot. This is true. They're the most difficult pistols to shoot accurately and then manipulate as far as loading, unloading, and that type stuff. So revolvers are not for beginners. They are for experts and only for people that are going to put the time in necessary to actually learn how to shoot it accurately, reload it, manipulate it properly and everything. In that case, they are great weapons for self-defense. The training between a semi-auto and a revolver is completely different. I can take somebody that has never fired a handgun before and spend about an hour, hour and a half with them, and I can have them shooting a semi-auto accurately, loading and unloading it properly and reloading it properly. With a revolver, one thing, it's a more difficult weapon system as far as the stroke of the trigger and that type stuff, so it takes a little bit longer to get used to. But also when it comes to manipulations, reloading, that type stuff, there's 2 techniques for everything. I can keep it in the strong hand and manipulate it there, or I can transfer it to the support hand to manipulate it there. So right off the bat, there's 2 ways of doing all of that. Both are acceptable, but it depends on the individual as to which one is going to work the best. And then when it comes to ammo, there's like multiple ways, but 3 main ways to carry ammo. You can carry them in a pouch, you can carry speed strips, you can carry speed loaders. And then there's multiple places to carry that ammo depending on whether you're going to keep it in the strong hand to manipulate it or transition it to the support hand. So right off the bat, you got a whole lot more that you have to cover in order to discover for this student with that pistol and their hand size, this is what's going to work best for them. So it will take like a day to get an experienced shooter with semi-autos. It takes like a day to get them kind of tuned up with that revolver. And they still haven't figured out what works best, because once they learn this is how I do what I do, then they have to take it and practice each technique until they figure out this is what works best. Because a technique that might initially seem best, with a little repetition, you might discover, well, actually technique B works better than this once I actually know what I'm trying to do. So it is a lot, the learning curve is a lot steeper with a revolver. We're getting a lot more inquiries on revolvers. And part of it is definitely because people are ordering choppers, and then we're kind of doing a full chopper package where you can order the pistol, you can get the holster we recommend, and then you can also get a training class for that pistol. So it's a package kind of deal. But also revolvers are becoming more popular, and all of this kind of runs through cycles, right? Revolvers are big today. 10 years from now, they won't be. 15 years, there'll be a resurgence. But the other thing that's going on is that you've got a lot of different manufacturers that now offering great revolvers. So like Kimber's building revolvers, Colt's reintroducing the Snake series guns, Ruger is making some really great lightweight carry revolvers and that type stuff. So anytime there's a lot more press on revolvers and they're in the gun magazines and that kind of stuff, you see it kick back up again. And then part of my, I'm like a revolver ambassador. I'm kind of telling people, hey, if you're serious about this for self-defense, and I know you're going to put in the practice necessary, this might be something you want to consider and look at.